Welcome back to the next part of our lesson on general biochemistry. Today we're going to be talking about some of the properties of water. Water is essential for life, but it's very important that we understand its chemical properties before we get to the point where we can talk about why it's so useful. Unfortunately, since there are a lot of properties, we will have to split this section into another two parts, because otherwise it would just get too long. So without further ado, we're going to start off by talking about hydrogen bonding. So water has polar covalent bonds, and if you remember that from our previous video, you'll know that that means that the bonds do not share electrons evenly. In this case, oxygen is the more electronegative atom, which means it holds on to the electrons for longer and therefore has a slightly negative charge, while the hydrogens have a slightly positive charge. We see the same phenomenon in this water molecule, and what happens as a result of this is the slight negative charge and the slight positive charge attract each other, causing this kind of interaction between molecules, or IMF, intermolecular force, known as hydrogen bonding. And the reason I put bonding in quotations is because it's not like your regular covalent or ionic bond. Rather, it's an attractive force, not so much a bond. And in fact, this is so important that most of water's unique biological properties are derived from this single trait. And just before we move on from hydrogen bonding, let's talk about the conditions. The thing that makes this different from any normal interaction between molecules is that a hydrogen atom has to interact with any of the three most electronegative atoms. Those are nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. Any of these can form a powerful hydrogen bond, and it's much stronger than any regular interaction between molecules. Great. So now that we've asserted that, we can go on to talk about some of water's other properties that are as a result of the hydrogen bonding. The first to talk about is cohesion. Cohesion is this property of water molecules, or really any molecule, to stick to other molecules of its own kind. They have this strong attraction between each other. And while it's present in most molecules, it's very rarely noticeable or dominant outside of water. Water is one of the examples of a molecule with extremely strong cohesive forces. The reason is this oxygen and this oxygen are available for a hydrogen bond, as are the hydrogen and hydrogen from here. And these two hydrogens are also readily available to make hydrogen bonds with this oxygen. So one important property of hydrogen bonds in water is that water can form two with its oxygens and one each with its hydrogen. And we'll go into this in the chemistry series. For now, it's important just to know that water can form 4 hydrogen bonds, which is much more than any other any other molecule of this size. That's why it's able to stick to each other so strongly. This gives rise to another property called surface tension. Surface tension. If you look at a body of water, or just a general, a few molecules, the molecules in the middle of this arrangement are going to have cohesive forces acting on them from all directions. For example, this molecule is getting pulled everywhere. But a molecule at the top won't experience the same thing. If we look at this one, it's only getting pulled to the side and downwards. This causes the surface of the water to sort of tighten up like a film so that it can resist a lot of pressure. This is the reason why, if you've ever tried to put a few drops of water on a quarter, you might think at most 20 or 30 drops will fit, but really you can get really high numbers up to 40, 50, sometimes even 60 if you're doing it carefully. This is because the water molecules are just pulling themselves in more tightly and building onto that film. This is the property of surface tension that makes cohesion so important. Next, we're going to talk about adhesion. Adhesion is different from cohesion in that instead of a molecule sticking to another molecule, it's a molecule sticking to a different type of molecule. So while cohesion was water sticking to water, adhesion would be something like water sticking to glass, as we see here. The reason for this is the same as cohesion. Water can form a lot of hydrogen bonds, and if there are any electronegative oxygen, nitrogen, or hydrogen atoms in the wall's surface, then the wall will be negatively charged and available for hydrogen bonding, which allows our water molecules to stick very strongly to the walls. And if this shape looks familiar to you at all, it might be because you've heard about something called capillary action. Capillary action is this phenomenon that basically says if you have water molecules like this, and all of a sudden you put some kind of inverted tube in here, the water molecules here will start climbing, and the level inside this tube will be higher. And while this is due to multiple properties, it's mostly because of adhesion. Water is attracted to the sides of the container, and as the container gets thinner, it's more strongly attracted. But what about that curved shape we saw on this page? Why does that happen? Well, there are especially two versions of this shape. First, if adhesive forces are stronger than cohesive forces, then our meniscus, which is what that curved shape is called, will be concave. Concave means it'll be like this. The reason for that is the water molecules are going to stick more strongly to the walls because of adhesion than they are to stick to each other because cohesion is weaker. This phenomenon is a concave meniscus. I'll spell that out for you guys as well. The alternate case is a convex meniscus. You'll notice I'm representing them with smiley faces and frowny faces. Basically, look at it from the perspective of adhesion. If adhesion is less, it's a frowny face, and that downwards is representing the convex meniscus that's formed when adhesion is weaker. Meanwhile, the smiley face is the concave meniscus. Just observe the lips. Now, the reason for the convex meniscus is that while water molecules will start falling off the sides more easily, they will stick to each other more strongly, allowing them to build up in the middle. That's what causes the convex meniscus scenario we see here. The entire phenomenon of adhesion and water molecules moving upwards is what we deem capillary action, whereas these meniscus situations are more so just for general understanding, and they will be useful in chemistry. This case is more common of something like water, whereas this case is of something more viscous, or something that's more tightly attached to itself than to the walls. Lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about energy. Kinetic energy is something that a lot of us will know as the energy of movement, and that's a perfectly fine definition to use for the purposes of biology, at least for now. But the energy from the random movement of molecules specifically is called thermal energy. A lot of times people will say that thermal energy is the same thing as temperature, but that's a common misconception. That's actually not the case at all. Thermal energy is volume dependent, whereas temperature is not independent. This basically means that thermal energy is the total amount of kinetic energy of all the molecules in something, whereas temperature is the average kinetic energy. So while thermal energy increases if you add more molecules, temperature doesn't necessarily increase. So once again, volume increases, thermal energy increases. Volume increases, temperature may not increase or decrease. It's random. It depends on the kinetic energy of the molecules you're adding. The easiest way I found to visualize this was to look at a coffee pot and then compare it to something like a swimming pool. Pause the video now and see if you can guess which one has a higher thermal energy and which one has a higher temperature. Bonus points if you can explain why. Alright. The coffee pot is smaller, therefore it should have less thermal energy, which I'll represent using yellow. But a coffee pot will probably be at or above boiling temperature, which is 100 degrees Celsius. Which means the temperature will probably be much higher than a swimming pool. You don't want all the water in your swimming pool to be boiling, or you would be in deep trouble. A swimming pool is much larger though, so the total kinetic energy of its molecules will be greater. That means the thermal energy is greater, whereas you definitely want the temperature to be lower, or you'll be boiling alive. The very last thing to discuss here is heat and the units of heat. Now, one thing is that if you are a fellow American like me, we unfortunately do not use the system that we use in America. We use the metric system for most of our measurements. Heat is defined as the transfer of thermal energy, and it's true, when molecules collide, they can transfer some of their thermal energy to each other. That's heat. Especially when larger objects made of multiple molecules collide. If this object has a higher thermal energy and this one has a lower thermal energy, and they collide, thermal energy will be transferred, like this. That's heat. A calorie is the amount of energy that's needed to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius, and it's a common unit of energy measurement. If we take this cube, for example, and say it's 1 gram of water, and then we take the sun, and we have the sun providing energy to this gram of water. It's constantly transferring thermal energy, which we just defined as heat. However, the amount specifically of thermal energy that causes the temperature to increase by 1 degree Celsius, that is 1 calorie. 1 calorie, abbreviated as CAL. You might be thinking, hey, I recognize that term calorie. I see it on the back of food labels all the time. And you're not wrong in that sense. It's definitely a unit that's involved with labeling energy. But it's not the traditional unit that you would think it is. In fact, a calorie with a capital C is actually representing a kilocalorie, which is 1,000 of the calories with a lowercase c. This is the unit you see on the back of your food packaging. And remember that the human body needs thousands of calories a day, which means millions of small c calories. That's a lot of energy that you're using. That's just a nice way to put that into perspective. The very last thing we want to talk about now is specific heat, and I feel like I've said that like a few times by now, but seriously, last thing. Specific heat is the amount of heat that needs to be added to a substance to raise 1 gram of that substance's temperature by 1 degree Celsius. And you might be thinking, hey, so isn't that just a calorie? Well, a calorie is specifically for water. Specific heat is for any substance. So if you were thinking, is the specific heat of water 1 calorie? That's correct. So we represent this in calorie, or units of energy, divided by the mass, so grams, and the temperature by degrees Celsius. And sometimes we'll use an alternate unit of measurement. This is called a joule. And we use this very often in physics, and even in thermodynamics and chemistry. And it's just another way of representing energy. 1 calorie is 4.184 kilojoules, or 4,184 joules. And that's about it for today's lesson on all of the properties of water. As a recap, today we covered hydrogen bonding, cohesion and adhesion, surface tension, capillary action, and the meniscuses. I'm actually not sure if that's the plural version. I'll have to look into that. Kinetic, thermal energy, and temperature, heat, units of energy, and specific heat. And that's about it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.